I am going to hit broadcast. Good evening, and thank you for joining this evening's presentation of Going Beyond Climate Action and Public Safety. I'm Christine Symington, the Program Director of Sustainable Princeton. Before we start, I'd like to thank our program sponsors, NRG, and our partners at the Princeton Public Library. And to kick things off this evening, we're going to start a quick poll. Should all be seeing a poll now on your screens. And we'd like to know what your biggest concerns about your personal health and safety are as a result of climate change. You can pick your top 3 or your top 1. So take a few moments and fill out this poll. And once we've got a decent number of responses, I will share the results. We've got about 88% of folks have voted, so we'll give a few more seconds for the rest of our audience. Okay, so here are the results. It looks like 59% of our audience is concerned about injury from weather-related events. 53% are worried about the spread of disease from ticks and mosquitoes. 41% are worried about respiratory and breathing problems. And 12% are concerned about working outdoors in the heat. So, our panelists this evening are certainly going to be able to talk about all of these. So stay tuned, and hopefully we'll hear about how you can reduce the risks from these concerns that you have. So a few housekeeping items before we start with our moderator and our speakers. The webinar is being recorded and will be available on Sustainable Princeton's website in a few days. You can submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button in the toolbar, which is probably at the bottom of your screen. You can upvote questions that you see from other attendees by clicking on the upvote thumbs icon. And want to make sure that you're aware of our upcoming events. Tonight's event is part of a series. It's the second of the series focusing on the co-benefits that have been identified in Princeton's Climate Action Plan. If you missed our first event of the series about climate action and economic sustainability, you can check that out on our website or our YouTube channel. And please save the date for February 3rd, where we will delve into climate action and promoting equity. And then our last of the series on April 7th, which is about climate action improving local and environmental quality. So what are co-benefits? The Princeton Climate Action Plan identifies 5 possible co-benefits for every action we have in the plan. One is promoting equity. A second is fostering economic sustainability. Third is improving local environmental quality. Fourth is enhancing public safety and health, and that's what we're going to dig into tonight. And lastly, building resilience. So as I mentioned, in our climate action plan, we have these co-benefits, and every action in the 5 focus areas that we have: energy, land use and transportation, natural resources, material management, and resiliency, there are potential co-benefits. And so this diagram is trying to show how there's this cumulative impact of multiple benefits when we try to address climate change and reducing our emissions. We get all these other benefits that go along with that emissions reduction. So what does it mean if an action enhances public safety and health? What does that action do? It reduces the impacts on human physical and mental health and improves disaster planning and management. So our moderators and 3 speakers tonight are going to be covering how, when we take action against climate, we can reduce the impacts on human physical and mental health and improve our disaster planning and management. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to tonight's moderator, Nicole Bronzan. Nicole is the Senior Communications Officer at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. She was a member of the Princeton Climate Action Plan Steering Committee. She's a Princeton resident. She's also volunteered with Sustainable Princeton. And at Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, she brings journalistic roots and an advocate's passion to the foundation's work to ensure that everyone has the opportunity for a healthier life. She's a newswoman at heart. She sees storytelling as the binding thread of her career. She spent her formative years as an editor at the New York Times. Her work spanning breaking news, investigative series, and online features. And she comes to Robert Wood Johnson Foundation from ProPublica, Pulitzer Prize winning investigative newsroom. So I am now going to bring Nicole on. Give me a moment.
Hi there. Thanks so much, Christine. So I'm just going to open up this conversation, bridging really the gap that we sometimes see, that really isn't there, but that we sometimes think is there between climate and health. And I hear this a lot in my work, which is more on the health side. So I'm showing you a picture of a glacier that is much smaller than it used to be. Because, until recent years, it really felt like when we talked about climate change, we were talking about polar bears and far-flung countries that we couldn't really identify with, or in this case, melting glaciers. This is actually a picture from Glacier National Park, which I visited last year with my best friend. And it was really sad to see actually the glaciers melting and thinking, will my kids see this? But I think what we're trying to do here is show that it's not just about the glaciers, which are beautiful and which we do need, but it's about our local lives. We're human and we need boxes and categories to make sense of the world, but that's not really how the world works. So in my field in health, we talk about a culture of health, which really is about breaking down those silos mentally for us, to show that health affects everything and vice versa. And similarly today, we're going to talk about how climate affects everything and including health, of course. Next slide, please. So yes, climate and health. We see everywhere, actually, if we're looking with the right lens, you see extreme heat, wildfires, you see hurricanes that are more intense and more frequent. We're seeing insect-borne diseases like Lyme disease in West Nile spreading way beyond where they've been before. Toxic algae blooms, weather patterns disrupted, which is really disrupting the food supply as well. Good news here is that more people care about this and know about this. A Pew survey from this spring showed that 62% of Americans, actually did say that global climate change was affecting their local community a great deal or some. And then 2/3 of US adults said that the federal government is doing too little to reduce the effects of climate change. So people clearly care about this issue, which is important. Next slide, please. But the other thing we need to be careful about here is showing that, this isn't just about what could happen somewhere far away, but also what tends to affect some people more than others. Just like any other thing in this world, justice, crime, climate change is also a system of inequities. So we see low income and communities of color more likely to live near pollution producing power plants, and no, not because the rent is lower there and they chose to live there, but because the plants were actually placed there. You see people with pre-existing health conditions, asthma, heart disease, facing greater threats from air pollution and reduced air quality on those hotter days. So we'll hear today about how climate change really magnifies those inequities and really prevent people from achieving the healthy life that we all deserve. The quote here is actually from Philip Alston, who's the U.S. special, or who was the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights. And he was releasing a report last year on climate change and declared that it threatens, quote, to undo the last 50 years of development, global health, and poverty reduction. And the quote here is that we risk a climate apartheid scenario where the wealthy pay to escape overheating, hunger, and conflict, while the rest of the world is left to suffer. And that's really what we don't want to see. Next slide, please. So the way to do it right then is to make sure that the commitment and the actions are local. And that's really why it's so great to see the Climate Action Plan here in Princeton and be a part of that work. You'll hear more about some of the state and local stuff happening around here. I just want to tell you a little bit about some things happening around the country that we're seeing at the foundation that really give us hope that communities are coming together to address these issues. For example, in Austin, which was facing extreme heat and seeing really a decrease in physical activity, we saw folks increasing green space by planting more trees and creating shade around the public schools, and especially those schools that serve students of color or those in lower income neighborhoods. And of course, more trees create cooler spaces for activity. They also lessen the need for air conditioning, which I had no idea, which actually uses 6% of the electricity that's produced in the United States. That's amazing. The Swinomish tribe of Washington State, kind of on the other end of the country, has relied heavily on salmon for generations and was actually one of the first communities to come together to assess the problem of climate change in 2010. And they were facing increased flooding, more acid in the ocean, rising river temperatures, destructive storms, loss of habitat, and really seeing their whole livelihood go down the drain. Since then, they have put in a CAP. They've restored tidelands, planted trees along stream beds to cool the waters, and collaborated with farmers to increase the stream setbacks. So all of this is a way to obviously bring back the salmon, but also it's really creating an ecosystem that can thrive for generations to come. So we're going to hear more about what's happening in our home state. I'd like to introduce our speakers. Next slide, please. And there we go. So you will see from left to right, Nick Angarone. He is the manager of the Bureau of Climate Resilience Planning at the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection. He's also a licensed professional planner who focuses on environmentally conscious, sustainable, and resilient communities. Secondly, Betsy Marshall, who is an occupational and environmental epidemiologist at Rutgers. She's in the School of Public Health and the Department of Biostatics and Epidemiology. She's also worked with immigrant worker organizations to improve occupational health and safety, including with construction workers and tree care workers. And interestingly, she's actually also collaborated with environmental, occupational, and infectious disease surveillance programs, which of course is pretty relevant these days, isn't it? And Dr. Marshall has also conducted environmental health research for the New York State Department of Health. And then thirdly, Michael Ye, who is the new director of Princeton Emergency and Safety Services. And this department manages the fire department, the fire marshal's office, housing bureau, and he's also the liaison for the first aid squad. Previously, he was the commander of emergency management and special operations at Rider University. And before that was a sergeant in the Lawrence Township Police Department. So with that, I will turn it over to Nick to get us started in our conversation today.
Give me just a moment, Nicole, to bring up Nick's slide.
Sure. This is one of those great joys of being on Zoom all day long, right? And just a quick reminder, folks, while we're waiting, that we will have a Q&A section after all of the speakers have their presentations today. So if you do have questions, feel free to put them in that box, or you can just hold them until later, but we will get a chance to address those.
Okay, Nick, you should be able to start your video.
Thanks, Nicole, Christine. Everybody can hear and see me, I assume. And good evening, everybody. I'm going to talk to you this evening about some of the activities going on at the state of New Jersey, in particular the Department of Environmental Protection, where I'm the manager of the Bureau of Climate Resilience Planning. That's all right, Christine, you can go ahead to that slide. So this slide should show, simply meant to show you that there's a lot of work going on related to climate change in both the greenhouse gas mitigation side of things, as well as the resilience and adaptation side. The things that I'm going to talk to you about this evening largely stem from Governor Murphy's Executive Order 89 and Executive Order 100. And so looking at this slide, that's the orange circles and the yellow circles. Go ahead, Christine. Go ahead, slide. Okay. So the first thing that I want to talk about, the first deliverable that stemmed from Executive Order 89 was we were tasked with and developed New Jersey's first scientific report on climate change. And so what this report did was compile all the most current and applicable information to New Jersey in one place, highlights New Jersey specific information, key findings that you can find throughout the report. I will note that it's over 200 pages, but there's a very nice 10-page executive summary that has the major conclusions easily viewable. I do encourage you to take a look at the report. I'm not going to be able to get through all of the key findings today, but I want to touch on a few that we should certainly expect to see going forward. Go ahead. All right, so first is heat. And right, it seems obvious, but all the impacts that I'm going to be talking about stem from increasing temperatures. And so I think the other important thing to note here is, particularly when we consider public health, right, is the poll you all just took, only I think 12% identified, working outside as a significant issue and, health concerns related to that. But there are, it's a significant piece of New Jersey's economy, right, are those who are working outside and those who are going to be impacted by heat, right, whether that be construction or, or retail or other service jobs. And so it's also a particular issue for those of us who, are socially vulnerable, so who aren't wealthy, who aren't using that 6% of all electricity for air conditioning. So this is going to be a significant issue for many in New Jersey going forward. Go ahead.
Nick, your volume's a little low. We've had a request to see if there's a way you can maybe amplify your sound, perhaps be a little closer to the microphone.
I will try and talk louder.
Okay, thank you.
So in New Jersey, we are fortunate enough to have temperature records going back 125 years from New Jersey's state climatologist. And so from the information on the slide, you can see that New Jersey has already seen a rise in average temperature of 3.5 degrees Fahrenheit. In the future, how much of a rise we see in temperature will depend on our emissions, greenhouse gas emissions going forward, right? And what we are expecting is that we'll see significant increases in average temperature through the end of the century. It's also important to note that when we see those temperature increases will occur differently across our seasons. And so we're going to see higher levels of temperature increase in the winter, which is also going to have significant impacts to the weather patterns that we've all been used to in New Jersey. Go ahead. All right, so increased temperatures are also going to increase our crops, right? New Jersey is the garden state. We are going to see impacts as temperatures increase and our growing seasons get longer and hotter and our winters get shorter. And so what that means is that the periods of time when we're frost free will be longer. And for some crops like blueberries and cranberries, right, which are New Jersey, crops, this is going to have significant impacts. And right, these crops need longer chill periods to flower and produce their fruit, meaning that they're going to struggle to thrive in New Jersey in the future. The increased temperature will also mean that crops that initially may do well in warmer conditions are going to, though, be stressed by other impacts, such as the amount of water available. Sorry, I have teenagers. What the other thing that, it's also going to impact the flora and fauna in New Jersey. And so New Jersey's state bird, the goldfinch, is also vulnerable. And so the Audubon Society has noted that in the future, based on our projections, New Jersey will be too warm for the state bird to actually nest and thrive in New Jersey. Go ahead. So I know you all hear about it a lot, but in New Jersey, sea level rise is amplified above the global rate due to local factors. What we're looking at through 2050 is another 1 to 2 feet of sea level rise. And what's an important point is that rise is already baked in, right, based on the greenhouse gas emissions that have already been released. But beyond 2050, future emissions, the things that we do now will impact our sea levels. And using a moderate emissions scenario, which is what most scientists feel that we are currently trending for, is that we're still going to see another 2 to 5 feet above current levels. And that's going to have significant impacts on the Jersey Shore and the resources and culture that we've all been experiencing here in New Jersey. Go ahead. So precipitation patterns will also be changing. And so we similarly have precipitation pattern records going back 125 years, and we see already that over the last 100 years, we've seen an increase of 8% over the long-term average. And so that is expected again by 2050 to increase about another 4 to 11% over average. But again, what we do going forward will impact how bad this gets. What's, I think, important to note is that while the total amount, right, on an annual average that we get on a year won't, right, 4 to 11 isn't a huge impact. But what is going to significantly impact us is how we and when we get those that precipitation. And so what's expected is that we are going to get stronger storms with significantly more precipitation, right, in shorter periods, which you're probably already, right, feel that you're seeing as it is. And right, so that's going to increase our flooding, and that's going to increase our stormwater flooding, and all of the implications of that. But that also means that we're going to see longer periods in between those precipitation events, longer dry periods. And so while these aren't technically droughts, it will have similar effects, and they're going to be particularly exacerbated at the same time that we're having more increased temperatures. Go ahead. So we'll note again that there were many findings in the scientific report that we don't have time to cover tonight, but I do really suggest you take a look. And the things that I've mentioned here and the things that are in the scientific report are the things that we're going to begin addressing in a statewide climate change resilience strategy. Go ahead, Christine. So as I noted, Executive Order 89 from Governor Murphy directed that New Jersey develop a climate change resilience strategy. The strategy will be forward-looking, focused on state-level strategies that start to address those impacts that we've talked about this evening. Go ahead. One of the primary pieces that also came out of that executive order was the establishment of the Interagency Council on Climate Resilience. The council is made up of 17 state agencies and departments across New Jersey. And the primary charge of the council is to coordinate and develop long-term mitigation, adaptation, and resilience strategies that will inform the statewide strategy. Go ahead. So we've been working on this for a while, and while it is still under development, what I can tell you at this point is it is primarily made up of 6 core strategies. Also, please understand that overarching all of these strategies is a goal to consider social equity and environmental justice, which are also priorities for Governor Murphy and the department. So I'm just going to touch on these really quickly. The first is to support and share the science. And so this strategy will contain actions that both improve our knowledge of climate change to inform our policymakers, but also to ensure that our public understands what's involved and what's at risk. That second strategy, build resilient and healthy communities, right, is probably when we start talking about resilience, what a lot of people brains go to, right, is how are we going to protect ourselves? And if you think about flooding in particular, right, how are we going to protect ourselves from that increased flooding? And it will include a lot of that. But what this also will do is seek to align actions by the state to better support our local governments and our communities, right? And we've heard for years now that our local governments can just please tell us what to do, and a lot of the strategies in here will go to that point. Just like the previous strategy will provide actions to strengthen communities and people, the third strategy will focus on actions to bolster the ability of our forests, our rivers, our wetlands, and our other ecosystems to adapt to a changing climate. And so inherent in this strategy is the recognition that healthy ecosystems also benefit us. When we talk ecosystems in this case, we are talking about everything from forests to water to our agriculture, and things such as forest fires will also be addressed here. This fourth one, promote coordinated governance, which is not the sexiest of strategies, but is one of the most important things that state government can do, certainly. And so it's based on the idea that climate change is an all-encompassing issue, and it's going to impact every one of us. And we need a whole of government approach here to be successful. The fifth strategy, expand resilience funding and financing. We know it's going to be expensive. How are we going to pay for this? And other actions in the strategy will ensure that climate change is considered in all of the state's decision making. Finally, the executive order directed that we develop a specific coastal resilience plan in recognition that our coastal zone is going to see significant impacts above and beyond a lot of our inland communities. Go ahead, Christine. At the same time, New Jersey, the DEP is working to amend a lot of its regulations to ensure that we're incorporating climate change and resilience. And so just really quickly, we are in the process of updating our coastal rules, our flood hazard rules, wetlands, and stormwater regs, many of which will directly impact you. And so, those regs have, the goals to protect our public health and safety, right, in recognition that we do still need to enable development and redevelopment in a safe, sustainable, and resilient manner. Go ahead. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was what are some local actions? What are some actions that Princeton and surrounding communities, including mine, can take now? And Princeton's ahead of the game, which you are all aware. Which is great. And it's always easier for me to be able to identify when I'm working with other communities, actions that are already happening in our state. So this has been extremely helpful to me, just being able to present to you all today. Go ahead, Christine. But there are some things that we kind of recommend that everyone do. And some of these first 5 recommendations here are things that every municipality in New Jersey can do. And first one, it seems really simple, again, good governance here, but is to, within our local governments, to appoint a climate change coordinator. So I currently work for New Jersey's Chief Resilience Officer, and one of his roles is to ensure that there's coordination amongst all of the agencies, right, that interagency council. And similarly, we always recommend that local governments in particular identify that one person whose job it is to coordinate across all the offices. Some of the things that we find most often when we're working with our local partners is it seems so simple. Literally getting all the office heads in the same room doesn't happen that often. It's something that is very likely happening more frequently now in response to the pandemic, but it's not something that happens frequently in most governments where they get together and everybody understands what everybody's doing on climate. Second, to know your risks, right? Again, seems like an obvious thing, to assess your vulnerability. So this is not just kind of who's going to get wet, but it's going to be how frequent it's going to be, and what are the impacts to your community, to your neighborhoods, and to your populations, to your socially vulnerable populations, when we start seeing these increased impacts from climate change. Third, outreach and education, right? You need an educated public to understand and support what very likely may be some tough decisions that have to be made. So engaging the public, working with partners, is something that we heartily recommend. We also think it'd be great if you could be innovative, right? And working with groups who are not your typical partners is a way to kind of get your message to different communities, to people who wouldn't normally be on an event like tonight, for example. Plan ahead, include climate change in all of your planning and decision making, right? Your master plan, your zoning ordinance, your capital plans, your budget, integrate it throughout your governance. And right, the topic of tonight, consider the public health implications. It's going to impact our public health in a variety of ways, whether that be heat stress or new pests. And so I will certainly defer to Betsy on that in more detail. And so 3 key takeaways from me. Climate change is not something that's in the future. It's only in the future, right? Climate change is happening now, right? Whether it's those increased, rain events that we all feel, whether it's the insane hurricane season that we had this year, or whether it's new pests coming in and destroying our crops and trees, right, that we've all grown up with. We need to start taking action now. This is an all hands on deck issue, right? Climate change is not something that we can sit around and rely on one level of government to do, or government, right? Just government at all. It has to be an all hands approach. And finally, I mentioned that, the things that we do now are going to impact the long-term effects of climate change, right? And a lot of times these presentations can seem kind of overwhelming with kind of the doom and gloom, but we can take action now that will mitigate the worst effects of climate change. And again, Princeton's ahead of the game here, and that's great. But there's always more we can do from whether that's local government or whether that's our individual actions. Christine, the last slide is simply where you can get more information from DEP, and if you want to reach out to us, that's how you can do it. Thank you.
Great. I will bring you back on, Nicole.
All righty. Thanks so much, Nick. So next we will hear from Dr. Marshall, who's going to tell us more about her work in epidemiology. And bear with us as we switch platforms again.
Hello, can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Okay, all I can see is Christine, but that's okay. So hi, Nicole, thanks so much for your introduction and welcome to everyone attending. As Nicole described, I'm an environmental and occupational health person, and I'm a faculty member at Rutgers. I have lived in Princeton for over 20 years now and have worked in the field for even longer than that. And of course, now as like many public health people, to some extent, everyone is working on COVID-19. So today I'm going to speak briefly about the health effects of climate change and try and touch on some aspects of that list of health impacts that might be of interest here in Princeton. And some of the other speakers have already talked about this, so I'll try not to repeat things. So one thing about the COVID-19 pandemic has been, it has really highlighted how we are all in this together. I mean, we all talk about vulnerable populations and sensitive communities, et cetera, but this has really become clear that we're all in this together, that public health and healthcare workers and the people who cook and sell our food, who come to our communities to help to teach our kids and to take care of our elders and to fix our computers so they Zoom right, all sorts of people that are essential workers and people of color. But these essential workers and many people of color are also at increased risk of infection and more severe disease of COVID-19. However, these groups also tend to be some of the people that are most vulnerable to the health impacts of climate change. So I think it's a good time to point out those aspects as we move forward on this climate action plan. So Christine, if you could just show the next slide, which is an animated slide from the Centers for Disease Control showing, if you can watch the circle move, the rising temperatures, the increasing CO2, the sea levels, and the extreme weather. And then this second circle are the hazards essentially that come about because of those changes. And I won't go through all of them, but they include severe weather, air pollution, changes in vector ecology, water quality, environmental degradation, increasing allergies, extreme heat. And then on the very outside, the CDC just gives some examples here of the kinds of kinds of health impacts that would be expected given these specific changes. So keep that circle in mind as we go forward. Okay, so just to kind of go back to that concept of vulnerable population. In general, as epidemiologists, we talk about this as groups of people who may be more susceptible to a disease or more likely to be exposed to a hazard or more likely to have severe health effects. And for climate change specifically, and this was done prior to COVID-19, but so the populations of concern, especially identified by CDC, include low income, some communities of color, immigrant groups, some of whom have limited English, children and pregnant women, older adults, vulnerable occupational groups, persons with disabilities, and persons with pre-existing or chronic medical conditions. And I'm just going to take a break here a second. Christine, I can't see myself. Is the video on?
Yes, you're on.
Oh, okay, so let's take one that Nick talked about quite a bit, and I'm sure Mr. Ye is going to talk about even more, and that is these severe storms. And obviously severe storms, as Nick described, there is the concern about flooding. There's concern about power loss and who's sensitive to power loss. But there's also the increased risk. There's a lot of, every time there is a major storm or flooding or power loss or trees down, all those things increase the risk of injuries, exhaustion, and stress, not just to residents, but also to workers, to first responders. And this is a picture of, I don't know if this was in Princeton, but it certainly could have been in Princeton post-Sandy, where you have a tree down and you can see these individuals who've been working hours and hours and hours. They're dealing with chainsaws. Many of the individuals who end up responding to severe storms and to rebuild are immigrant workers. Some may have less training and less experience than some of those that are higher paid. So there's just this vulnerability associated with response and recovery. And there was an increased risk of severe injury post Hurricane Sandy. So next slide. So I want to take a little more time about extreme heat because I think that it's a little bit misunderstood. An extreme heat event, or a heat wave, we would call it, is characterized by weather that is substantially hotter or more humid for a particular location at a particular time. And this always mystified me because I'm from Southern Virginia, so of course it's hotter there than it is here even now. But part of it is that humans do become adapted to heat over time. You have to prepare individuals to be more adapted to heat. Next slide. So what are some of the health effects of extreme heat? If you've ever coached or had children in hot environments, you may have heard about some of these. There's heat-related illness specifically, such as heat stroke, people faint, and obviously people can die from extreme heat. But heat also can exacerbate chronic disease. It is associated with an increased risk of heart attack among those who have cardiovascular disease, increased respiratory effects, and also kidney disease, kidney stress. And as I just described, or related to that, is extreme heat or heat over time can increase the risk of severe injuries. Basically, when you're really, really hot, your brain tends to not work as well in terms of your balance and decision-making and other things that might increase your risk of injury. Next slide. So just a little bit more about the vulnerable populations that we've talked about. In this case, extreme heat, you can imagine that elderly people, especially those who might live alone and have no assistance, would be vulnerable to extreme heat. Children, people with pre-existing chronic diseases, people taking certain medications, athletes who try their best but may overdo it in the heat, outdoor workers we've talked about, but also there are some work environments that can be extremely difficult to cool adequately. So you can imagine that commercial kitchens, for example, or some warehouses, some athletic event venues are just difficult to keep cool enough. And then those with inadequate housing or homeless are obviously subject to extreme heat, and those without air conditioning or air conditioning that doesn't function properly. Next slide, please. So this is actually a picture from Princeton. This is a gentleman who is, I guess, replacing the roof on this house. And he's obviously at risk of injury just because he's at risk of injury because he's on a roof without any fall protection. But he also, if this was a really hot environment, you can imagine if this was a hot day and he'd been up on that roof for 3 hours already, and it was over 95 or over 90, then his risk of injury would be even higher because it's just a very stressful environment. Next slide. So just to give you another example, as Nick and Nicole both described, warmer temperatures and heavier rain events, because it increases the amount of water that sort of sits in one place, increases mosquito populations and the likelihood of expanded or new vector-borne diseases. So in the case of mosquitoes, and I think these might be, I don't know my mosquitoes, these might be Asian tigers. The expansion of the mosquito populations are associated with, currently we don't have malaria in New Jersey, but there is the potential for things like West Nile, for dengue, for other viruses carried by mosquitoes, as well as expansion of Lyme disease. Next slide. So this just gives an example. This is from Climate Central that's based in Princeton, of the average fall temperature in Newark. This is Newark itself, not the whole state, but you can imagine. And it shows that this is increasing over time. And one of the impacts of that is, as Nick described, it does change the agricultural practices. It also changes how, for example, schools must prepare for athletes being warmer, because you start football early and coaches need to, like employers, need to have plans for how to deal with heat and to adapt athletes and workers to heat before it happens, and then to make plans to try to mitigate those potential health problems. So let's just go, so going back to that original circle of health impacts, you can see that I've talked about changes in vector ecology, I've talked about severe weather, I've talked about extreme heat. There are obviously some other effects. I'm going to make one point about, there's one that's called environmental degradation, which sounds pretty general, but I think that, New Jersey has many immigrants, and Princeton has many immigrants, and one of the impacts of that is already dramatically affecting our politics and the immigration status is the impact of climate change in other places that has put a huge amount of stress on people to emigrate because of environmental degradation and the lack of the farm environment being so difficult that they have difficulty producing enough food. So after I guess after this, I just have a summary slide, and that is really kind of questions. Given what we've talked about, the negative health effects of climate change, how can we reduce those negative health effects, or at least mitigate the effects of climate change? How do we really protect vulnerable populations, the elderly, those who need assistance, those who might need special protections and services? And in addition, we need to assist those who would provide us with services and goods. We will actually need services and goods as a consequence of climate change. We will need to have floods cleaned up and different types of services provided in response to climate change, and we need to assist those who will be providing those services and goods. And then I guess my own interest really is, how do our decisions to try to respond to climate change, how does that interface with national or international policies? And how can we best work with national and international bodies to improve the situation? So I'm happy to answer questions. I don't have a how to respond slide here, but basically you can find me under the School of Public Health, Elizabeth Marshall. I'm a faculty member, and Rutgers itself has a number of different activities. There's the Rutgers, it's sort of all centered in the Rutgers Climate Institute, which is a pan school. In other words, it includes several different schools associated with Rutgers, not just the School of Public Health. But that information also has extensive response to the climate change situation. So I can't see anybody, but
I'm here, Betsy. I don't know what's going on with Zoom, but we're here. You're not alone.
So who knows what I look like, but
we're going to turn it over to Michael Ye. Thank you so much, Betsy, for that overview. And just a reminder that Michael Ye is the new director of Princeton Emergency and Safety Services. here, and he had the distinct pleasure of starting in the middle of a pandemic, which sounds really just not like something I want to ever do, start a new job, much less a job related to disaster and emergencies. So we'd love to hear more about what you're doing and some tips you have for us.
Great, thank you very much, and I really thank the audience for attending this evening. So, as Nicole just said, I've been in this job for a few short months, but even though I've only been here for a few short months, I have a career in the emergency services side of things, which I'll be able to articulate and share with you and how that impacts Princeton in particular. So as we talk about how climate change impacts public health and safety, we'll get into the deeper aspects of how it affects you and the safety of your loved ones and your neighbors accordingly. Next slide, please. The number of named hurricanes and storms has increased dramatically in the last decade. This past year, there were close to 30 named storms across the globe. 12 of the named storms impacted the U.S., with 6 of them being named hurricanes. In New Jersey, on the East Coast, we were fortunate because those hurricanes, due to the weather patterns, impacted the Gulf states all during the whole hurricane season. The poor folks down there, as soon as they were able to recover from one storm, another storm was rolling in, and you know, the 2 hurricanes were only separated by about 30 miles in a 1-2 week period. So these changes in the climate have an obvious effect on people's physical well-being, in addition to where they live, where they work, and their whole community. So obviously, it's a much larger local and global effect on us as people. Regionally, in 2019 alone, there were 19 locations across the East Coast that tied records for high tides and flooding. And, you know, we're seeing that with these storms impacting and especially flooding the shore areas and also low-lying areas within our different communities. We don't even have to be close to the shore, but every community has areas that become flooded. And in Princeton, we certainly have those challenges. Locally, Princeton has experienced a number of storms that have affected the waterways and impacted roadways. I don't have to share that with you as being Princetonians, with these impacts of road closures and how they shut down roads for a period of time and impact the way you can get to a different location. Princeton in particular, like many of the towns that surround us in Mercer County, they all become islands, which is a huge challenge on the emergency services side of things, servicing our residents. Next slide. COVID-19 and the impact with that. You know, Dr. Marshall talked about this on how COVID-19 has had a huge impact, and Nicole also about, you know, we're talking about this global warming and how we've had more severe storms and hurricanes and serious storms. And on top of that, we've got this pandemic going. And obviously that's had a critical effect on when we have to evacuate people due to an incoming weather event. And the challenges there are different shelters are managed by the number of people that can occupy that safely, generally through the fire marshal's office. With the sheltering of these evacuees, as we try and maintain our safe 6-foot distance while we continue to wear our masks and so forth, that obviously cuts down the number of evacuees in each shelter that's approved. So that has an impact on how many people you can take in and the number of additional shelters that you'll have to open. And of course, there's an impact with that because you have to find enough staff to staff these shelters 24 hours a day, which is already a challenge before you even begin to accept evacuees. We're also obviously concerned with unknowingly sheltering evacuees who may be carrying the COVID virus with at-risk persons. You know, there are many people out there who have at-risk health conditions. And the last thing we want to do is expose them to somebody who may be carrying the COVID virus. Residents need to be very prepared to protect themselves and their families with masks and other tools to guard against the spread of COVID in this shelter type situation. Next slide. To meet Princeton's vulnerable population, Sustainable Princeton partnered with Princeton's Office of Emergency Management and created the Climate Change Hazards Annex as part of the Municipal Emergency Management Plan. That Hazards Annex is a very unique annex, which I haven't seen in other municipal emergency management plans. And it speaks of addressing in more particular how climate change affects our at-risk population and how we deal with managing, becoming aware of these at-risk populations, and how we're going to try and assist them during times of emergency. Next slide. And how we do that is we train our emergency responders and we equip them to be able to conduct search and rescue operations. The Princeton Fire Department was a fully volunteer fire department until the beginning of 2020. There had been many efforts to support the volunteer fire department to draw on new members, but things change in today's time with dual income families and many activities to fulfill. So, the town took the next step and hired 6 career firefighters. The first aid squad is also has a number of career staff, and between the two organizations, they have trained a number of staff that are trained as swiftwater rescue technicians. This is about a 40-hour class of physical instruction and practical evaluation to be able to get to people who are in need of rescue due to water situations, whether it may be a rescue from a vehicle or a fast-moving flood of a residence. A more stable, slowly rising flood is not as critical, where emergency responders can manage that rescue a little bit better. But of course, it's a very dangerous situation. As recently, we did lose a Princeton EMT to a swiftwater rescue attempt just a few short number of years ago. Our fire department and first aid squad staff members continue to recertify in this on an annual basis, and we provide them with specialized rescue equipment, personal flotation devices, and dry suits to so that they don't become too cold in the rushing water and are able to swim and conduct the rescues. Next slide, please. Princeton, so part of this annex also created the Princeton Prepares program. It's an extra assistance registry that identifies those that may be in need of assistance during an emergency. In particular, we're trying to focus on those at-risk people who may be elderly residents who live alone and will need help in an emergency, or residents who may have physical or cognitive limitations, or residents that rely on supplemental oxygen or have refrigerated medications. So we encourage these particular at-risk people to register so that we can try and connect with them prior to any storm event, to make plans and to encourage them to make plans prior to the arrival of any weather events. Next slide, please. To sign up for the Princeton Prepares program, if you go to the Municipality of Princeton website, there is a tab under there where you can click and sign up. Or if you're not too savvy on the computer, you can contact Princeton Human Services, and they will actually assist you in getting signed up for the program. But as I said it before, it's really important that personal preparedness is the first line of defense in an emergency. Registering with an extra assistance registry does not guarantee first responders will be able to assist you in the event of an emergency. I'm also a task force leader with the state police urban search and rescue team. It's a FEMA 80-person team. There are 3 teams of us that rotate for availability, and we go across the country. I've been with this team for 20 years, and I actually was deployed to Hurricane Katrina. And we arrived there 4 days after the hurricane arrived, and there were still 11,000 911 calls that had to be chased down to make sure people had gotten their help. And the first probably 5 days, I went out in a helicopter and we dropped boats in, or we walked to these residents to try and locate and make sure that they got the assistance they needed, they were evacuated, and no one needed help. And we were able to identify and remove a number of people who had still not sought any assistance, 4 to 5 days after the impact of the hurricane. They had no power. Some of the people were up to their waists in floodwaters, and they had no food and water. So just a terrible situation. On a more recent status, it's the hurricanes every year that we that are impacting our country. And our team actually goes out every year down to the Florida area, the southern area, the Louisiana area, to prepare to evacuate and rescue residents that are down there every year. Next slide, please. Updated communications. There's local mass communication that can be executed through the Princeton Police Department Nixle system. The police department is our primary communications tool to reach out to residents. And if you go to, again, the website, or princetonnewjersey.gov, under the Princeton Police Department, under the emergency phone notifications, you can sign up to receive updated information. The Nixle system used by the police is used for important information to the residents. So you're not flooded with notifications. We don't want people to become basically insensitive to these Nixle alerts. So they'll send Nixles out for some impending very severe weather or flooding, or even during an emergency, if there's large swaths of power outage or flooded areas, and even post-emergency where there may be charging areas for your electronics, heating and cooling centers, and where food and water may be set up. So these are all important ways to be communicated to, that they'll send a text and an email to you. Next slide, please. So you should have the 3 points that I want you to walk away with is number one, to stock your home. You should not be waiting for a couple of days or in the middle of this storm that's about to roll up to begin to think about your plan. When you stock your home, you want to stock your residents with non-perishable foods, with water, and also batteries for your flashlights and your radios. And we highly recommend that you do not use open flame devices like candles or incense. I was sharing with the other moderators, or excuse me, the other panelists today, that there was a fire up in Pennington, which was ignited by a candle. So a lot of times, if we're not prepared and we're not used to using candles and we're not paying attention, that candle burns down to a table and sets that table on fire. Or it may be in an area that'll set other curtains or something else aflame. So we need to be very cautious about that. Some things that you can use alternative to an open flame to candles is you can go to any local store like a Target or a Walmart. You can go online. Preferably, we ask you to shop local. So head to the Ace hardware store and look for these small battery lanterns. They can operate for many hours, even days, if you put it on a lower setting to be able to provide illumination when it's needed for you. But they're a much more updated, power-savvy device that's readily available. You should also be prepared to have supplies for 4 to 7 days in the event we have even a superstorm like Sandy that was out at the shore impacted the township for days. I know when I was working as a police officer in Lawrence, I had never seen it in my, it was about 20 years in by then when Hurricane Sandy or Superstorm Sandy hit, but there were trees and telephone poles across Route 206 in Lawrence. And in my career, the state would not stand for you closing a roadway for more than an hour. They would have, if you couldn't provide crews, they would send crews to chop up those telephone poles or trees or whatever. But it was actually days before crews were able to access and remove down telephone poles and trees. People were actually driving onto sidewalks going around these down trees. It was just a very interesting sight that unfortunately is becoming more common. Also, as you stock your home, make sure that your cell phone's charged in anticipation of a storm. Consider buying a cell phone battery pack. There are many different types of battery packs that are available to you. And each of these battery packs can charge your phone from basically at a full drain to 100%, probably 3 or 4 times. So seriously consider purchasing a cell phone battery bank. Next slide, please. When you're making that, the step number 2 is making a plan. You want to plan to monitor the storm, how it's going to impact you in particular and the area. Monitor by TV, social media, email, friends and family. Also communicate out to your friends and family. Make sure that they're making plans on what to do due to the lasting effects of the storm or how serious the storm may impact. Have a plan to include a place to relocate to in the event the electricity is going to be out for a number of days or longer. It's so important that you plan to try and make contact with friends or family a little bit further away, and especially if it's a storm that's coming in from the shore or something that's out of the southeast or southwest. You want to target someplace that's not going to be so impacted by a particular storm. You need to make these plans because emergency services are going to be tied up during this event. You can go ahead and flip to the next slide. Emergency services are going to be taxed with fires, with medical calls, with down trees and power lines, with many other things. So you can't expect the 30,000 residents in Princeton can't expect to call 911 and expect a police officer or a firefighter or an EMT to try and resolve their problems in the middle of that emergency. The best plan is for you to resolve your emergency, your family's emergency, without the need of emergency services. The key point number 3 is to make a go bag. Essential items that you'll need for several days. Believe it or not, importantly, is clothes, comfortable clothes and a change of clothes and underwear will make you feel much better when you're able to change them out after a couple of days. Medications, make sure you always have plenty of medications so that if you need to relocate somewhere, you're not going to run out within a week or so. If you need to speak to your doctor, consult your doctor and get that list of medications. I, in particular, have a family history of high blood pressure. When I deploy with the FEMA team to go assist persons, I have a 3-week supply of medications because we're tasked for 14 days. But when we went down to Hurricane, I went on so many, I forget. We were down in South Carolina and they thought about extending us out to 21 days. And I had already prepared for that. So my point to you locally is make sure you have a go bag with medications and clothing and important things to last you 4 to 7 days away from your home. Again, we talked about the importance of your cell phone and charger, and also contact information for friends and family to assist you in the event you can't return to your home in a short period of time. Next slide, please. Again, if you have any questions, you can sign up for these mass communications through the Princeton website. And as Nicole said, I currently serve as the Director of Emergency Safety Services, and I'm also the Emergency Management Director for the town. So please reach out and I will try and get you any assistance you need to make sure that you and your family are prepared. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mike. Those are some great tips. And it's interesting. We're actually at the end of hurricane season, obviously, but those are always good things to remember. So folks, we are ready to take questions. You can see here that there's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and you could use that to ask your questions. We've got a couple here that we'll get started with, but please feel free to add at any time. We're going to open up actually with one about the 3 degrees of increase in temperature that we heard about earlier. Nick, can you tell us more about this? The question is, has the impact from that 3-degree increase since 1900 been documented? And if so, what is that impact on the state?
So yes, right. So the data itself comes from the Office of the New Jersey State Climatologist. And so one example of how we an impact we have tied directly to the increase in temperature is that increase in precipitation, right? So when looking at the averages in the increase in temperature and the averages in the increase in precipitation, we've identified a statistically significant increase in the precipitation to those temperatures. So while again that the totals aren't significantly high, present or projected, when you start seeing kind of how the precipitation is coming, is when you're going to see the greatest impacts.
Thanks so much. One of the things that a lot of us talked about actually in one way or another was this idea of vulnerable populations and individuals. And so one of the questions we wanted to explore here is, none of us want to think of ourselves as vulnerable, right? So how do we get people to really understand that they are vulnerable and to protect themselves from these effects of climate change, and be that in an emergency sense, with impending hurricanes or floods, but also just generally, and just with air quality or the extreme heat. Does anybody have some tips for us on that?
I might recommend that. Think about how you would be with no power, no refrigerated food, no, maybe not water. How would you be for 3 or 4 days? And as you said, Nicole, we don't like to think ourselves as vulnerable, but people who are kind of in a moderate aged area, just those simple inconveniences will play quite an effect on our health and our psychological needs. Then we look at the vulnerable people who are at risk in health, elderly and younger people. We need to make sure that we think about those folks, we connect with those folks, our neighbors, and if they don't have a plan, help them develop a plan. And as you said, I think Betsy or Nick or you spoke of older folks in unair conditioned or unventilated homes. If we're in the summer and hurricane season, these folks are going to be, hugely at risk for suffering a terrible medical emergency. So you need to kind of step out of that comfort zone. How would you deal with those types of missing essentials and plan for that?
Mm-hmm. And that's really important. I think, especially your point about the medication. I think there are a lot of folks out there, especially, folks who are sort of new senior citizens, right, and who have their blood pressure medication or their cholesterol medication, and still, think of themselves as not particularly vulnerable. But at the end of the day, if there's a medication you need every day that you don't have, that's a problem.
So I guess I'll add to that this is what we're dealing with right now in terms of COVID-19 protections, right? So, I would go back to the principles we have learned over time how best to prepare these types of risk messages and what is most effective and what are the best social marketing activities. And certainly your foundation has done a lot of that work. So I guess I would say, let's try, and I'm sure you're doing it now if that money's available. How can we craft those messages appropriately, and what are the avenues by which we do make these assessments and give people real information that they can use successfully, and find out what the barriers to action are. And I think that and also just lots of mistrust in who's in the messages and who's giving the message and all those kinds of issues. So I think I'm actually optimistic that if we put our mind to it, we could improve the messaging that goes on around vulnerability and to expand those issues to people that, maybe you don't feel like you have that problem. Maybe it's somebody else's problem. But I think it's pretty clear that these climate change health effects would affect everybody at some level.
Yeah, well, and that's a really good point about messages, right? And that's one thing I do actually work a lot on. And it's really interesting when you start to dig into why people respond in certain ways to certain arguments or not. And actually, we have a related question, which is about it really sort of how do we have this conversation about climate change that shows that business as usual isn't free. It's not free to do nothing at this point. It's actually, going to cost us more in infrastructure damage, lives lost crops. So Betsy, do you have any tips on changing the conversation to talk about the costs of essentially doing nothing and the costs of mitigation?
I don't really know how to do that, or I've never done it, but I think that there's a lot that in terms of research and academics and policy analysts, they've really gone this way. And I don't have, I know that health impact analysis is one category of analysis that does this kind of thing. So I think it would be to try to find the individuals that do that kind of work and then make every effort to include those types of costs, which seem logical to me, that avoidance costs, so to speak. And I don't know the right terms for that, but I do know that there are that research that's structured that way to look at different costs and how do you take them into account.
Mm-hmm. Folks, just a reminder, if you have a question, you can use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen here. And we can see all your questions and actually filter them to the appropriate folks if you have one in mind in particular. So I was actually wondering, and I don't know if Mike, if this is one for you, but you talked about power outages and how they're more frequent. Is there anything underway to improve the infrastructure there? And I mean, I know people talk about burying power lines to avoid the sort of tree falling on them problem. Is there anything else that can be done about that?
That's a wonderful question, Nicole. That's it's something that Public Service and JCP&L had recognized after the Superstorm Sandy, and they were able to spend a lot of research and money into upgrading the infrastructure system. I know there's a large power run that goes through Hamilton, West Windsor, I think parts of Princeton, that if you remember the traditional transmission lines, they're all being replaced by monopods. They're 60 feet taller. They're very unattractive, but they really improve the reliability of the infrastructure in the surrounding community. So that's a statewide program, and they're looking at improving all aspects of essential utilities to the residents. And on the flip side, on the emergency response side, New Jersey Public Service has what we call mutual aid. When there's a fire, we call other fire departments in. Public Service will call other towns in to provide service crews. When I was for Hurricane Sandy, the Quaker Bridge Mall parking lot, when I was working as a police officer, I went through the lot. That was staged with over 300 public service vehicles, some as far away as Miami. So New Jersey has its plans in effect, and they continue to improve on those. So it's always good to know they're on top of trying to improve the utilities available to the residents.
So Nicole, I'll also add, specific to the issue of burying power lines, right? This is a question that is asked a lot. It's a question that I ask a lot, but this is my basic understanding of it is this. First, the cost is considerable, right? It's 5 to 10 times the cost of overhead lines. And while this information is a little bit dated, it's my understanding that it's about $1 million a mile to make the transition from overhead lines to underground lines. Other things to keep in mind is that outages can still occur even with underground lines. And in that case, it takes longer to actually correct that issue. They are also, right, related to that, more difficult to maintain, which is also another cost issue. And similarly, they're also more prone to flooding, right? So we're not just talking about sea level rise and coastal zone, but also stormwater flooding. So it's an issue that's very difficult to address, if only because of the cost. And once cost becomes an issue, right, that cost is going to come down to every one of us. And in which case, at the Board of Public Utilities, the ratepayer advocate, they have some issue here. And they've generally come out against burying power lines because of these costs, because those costs are going to come down to every one of us, and they're going to, as most things do, particularly hit, the costs are going to particularly hit those who can least afford to pay them.
Thank you. I actually didn't know that. I hear all the time that that it's much more expensive, but a million a mile is that puts it in perspective. So I think this is a question for probably all of you. We have a question about how our sort of surrounding states are working together. So we've got, Pennsylvania, New York. Do we have them working in concert? Do we have similar plans and priorities? And do we have a sense of how their choices affect us in New Jersey as well?
So I can certainly speak to kind of resiliency plans in other states. It's my understanding that New Jersey right now is the only state on the, I think in the East Coast, certainly the Mid-Atlantic, that does not have a climate plan. We are looking to address that issue. That's what I'm doing every day. But we're the gap in the line there. There is some coordination with surrounding states, with New York in particular, and to a lesser extent, Pennsylvania. But there is, because we have agencies that have authority on both sides of the the harbor or the river, there is some level of coordination. There's only when you start talking about, I think, significantly large regional projects does this really come into play. And it is starting to become an issue, right, with, for example, the tunnels under the Hudson. There's a significant climate nexus there. But also you might have seen in the paper that there's discussions about the regional electric grid, and how we tie into that, and the impacts to climate change mitigation. So the short answer is yes, there are some regional coordination, and I should note, right, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, which is a regional carbon pricing initiative, with the Mid-Atlantic states, which is spreading. So yeah, there's definitely regional coordination on that end.
Good to know. So we have a more logistical question. Mike, you had talked about the Nixle system, which I actually just want to plug briefly because I use it and I love it. And in particular, I think for the weather, but also the closures, the road closures are really helpful, and to know that there are downed wires. But we do have a question. Back when Sandy hit, there were mass notifications on the phone landlines, which are not available anymore. This is before my time. But this listener says we had great information and felt informed. But earlier this spring, there was a power outage for 4 to 5 days with no information, at least to our house. So concerning Nixle, it's just not widely known. How can we sort of get that out there better? And especially with the vulnerable populations and older folks who don't know about these new technologies.
So great question. We are targeting trying to educate our at-risk folks through our different communities that may hold at-risk folks or older folks. And in general, we have a number of flyers and magnets to go on refrigerators, and it's been a challenge to get them out and about, trying to meet people and get them out in that manner. But that's something we're working on. With the Nixle, I can't speak of the 4 to 5 day gap, but what I can tell you is that Nixle's alternatives are to text and email also. So I'll try and determine what the what the challenge was for that break during, I know that I remember the impact Princeton had with that severe storm, but I also want to make sure that we, as the emergency management director, that we have a reliable line of communication. So I'm going to try and figure out if there was an impact, with the police departments trying to get that out. But I know the Nixle, to your reference, is available through text and also email, in addition to the landline phone. So you can select all those things. But I will follow up on that to ensure that if we can ensure that there's no breakdown of communications, that's a high priority, obviously, of the town.
Okay, so you can get landline notifications from Nixle if you choose that way.
Absolutely. It'll, if I'm not mistaken, it'll ring your phone, but also your cell and also email.
Oh, okay, great. You can tell my generation, I'm sort of like, landline, what? So getting back to sort of the policy side, I'm thinking probably Betsy or Nick, can you talk about specific steps that that municipalities can take to encourage landlords to make residential properties more energy efficient and climate friendly?
No.
I don't have any great knowledge on that. I think that it's a long-term plan, and maybe that will come up, and I'm not sure if it's municipality by individually, or whether the state has to take the lead in that.
I mean, all right, there's things that businesses can do, landlords can do. I don't know that there's things necessarily that the municipality can do, but similarly to what a municipality can do, businesses, property owners there are tools and programs to calculate, your energy use and your carbon footprint. There are programs to help reduce energy use. There are incentive programs to from the transportation management agencies, for example, to promote, ride sharing and things like that. So I don't know that they're necessarily things that your town can do, but there are a number of programs throughout the state at various levels to promote those types of activities.
Hi, this is Christine from Sustainable Princeton. I can try to take a stab at that. I think I know what the attendee is getting at. When the challenges with landlords is what's called the split incentive. If they're not paying the utility bill, they're not incentivized to put in place energy efficiency upgrades because they're not the one that's going to realize the saving, it's the tenant. It's my understanding that the state understands that multifamily homes is a challenge, or commercial properties where you have landlords and tenants, and that they are looking at how to address that split incentive to provide the right kind of incentives for landlords to upgrade their facilities. I don't know what can be done at a municipal level in terms of ordinances and putting in policies or enforcement, because you come up against the municipal land use rules where you can't have something more strict than for energy efficiency standards for buildings than the state requires. So I think another avenue is to advocate at the state level to have higher building standards put in place, which will deal with new construction. But for existing construction, it's a real problem. And I think really the only avenue we have right now to local government is really to advocate and encourage landlords to upgrade their properties as a way of maintaining their investment.
It actually reminds me of, and I will just admit that I'm an electric car user and lover, and it just reminds me of the conversation, even a few years ago about gas prices, right, and electric cars, and sort of how do you have that conversation when there's no incentive if gas is so cheap and the electric cars cost so much. And of course we're seeing that now sort of shift in the balance. But this actually brings up a larger question, I think, one that one of our audience members has asked about really shifting to that longer term question. You know, yes, we can prepare for disasters. We can sort of do better on the ground. But what about this larger need to flatten the warming curve and really slow, stop, and reverse the atmospheric warming that we're seeing that's causing all of this?
So hi, Nicole, this is Molly, the Executive Director of Sustainable Princeton, chiming in with some thoughts on this challenge. I think, you know, here in Princeton, while we're a small drip in the bucket of climate change, we definitely are hugely conscious of this much larger problem. And so, you know, we really are looking to do our part, you know, in particular, when we look at emissions here in Princeton, it is roughly the lion's share, about 60%, is coming from the impact of heating, cooling, providing electricity to our buildings. And then transportation is about a third of our emissions. And then there's some other, you know, smaller things like our waste and wastewater, those types of things. So we are taking steps here to do what we can, looking at where we're resourcing our energy, trying to get that to be more from renewables, looking at what we can do to try to really encourage people to adopt electric vehicles because they have a smaller footprint. I think here in the community of Princeton, while we're small, we recognize that we have a great opportunity to kind of model behaviors that other small communities. We are so fortunate to have so many topic experts that are here working, putting great minds to work at these challenges. So we're really trying to leverage these opportunities to help, you know, solve some of these bigger challenge. So hopefully that answers the question.
Definitely. And as Christine mentioned, to start, I mean, that was the whole point of the Climate Action Plan, right? Which produces all these other benefits that we're talking about in this series. So I know we have a closing slide, and I will turn it over to Christine.
Give me just a moment. So I want to thank you, give my sincere thanks to Nicole, Michael, Nick, and Betsy for being our moderator and our panelists tonight. A reminder to folks that we have 2 more events. Please mark your calendars for February 3rd. We're going to cover climate action and promoting equity, which is a really critical co-benefit that we need to think about. As the speakers pointed out tonight, you know, climate change is going to disproportionately affect the most vulnerable in our community. So if we are serious about climate change, we have to think about the most vulnerable in our community and what we can do to right some of the inequities. And then our final event is going to be about improving local environmental quality, which is local water quality, air quality, ecosystem health, all of the other things you tend to think of when you think about sustainability. And also would like to make sure folks know where you can reach us at Sustainable Princeton. Yeah, if you don't follow us on Facebook or Twitter, Instagram, or LinkedIn, please do, to make sure you stay up to date on all of our other events. And you can sign up for our newsletter at our website as well. So with that, I'm going to bring our event to a close. Thank you again to everyone, and we wish everyone a very happy and safe rest of their week. Thank you very much.